everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive with us. Today, we're going to be looking at a research paper, and it's all about the role faith leaders play in trying to reduce poverty. Specifically, we're going to be focusing on northern Ghana.
Okay.
This paper, I gotta say, it really stood out to me, just from the title, because it highlights this kind of paradox.
Right.
Ghana is one of the most religious countries in the world. But at the same time, they have this persistent poverty issue, especially in the northern regions. So, by the end of this deep dive, hopefully we can unpack some of these complex issues and see why, there's not really any simple solutions when it comes to this topic.
Yeah. I mean, it's easy to think, if there's strong faith communities, that automatically means there's going to be less poverty. But like you said, it's way more complicated than that.
Yeah, absolutely. So the paper starts off by giving us this global perspective on poverty in general.
Okay.
And I don't know about you, but some of the stats in here are really pretty sobering. Did you know that over 2 billion people are living in poverty globally?
It's a huge number.
It's a massive number. And the impact, especially on children, it's really profound.
Yeah. And like you said, it's not just about a lack of money.
Right.
The paper is really careful to highlight that poverty is multidimensional.
Yeah.
It's about lacking access to resources, lacking opportunities to build skills, and it even gets into basic social rights that I think a lot of us kind of take for granted.
Yeah, for sure. And even trying to measure poverty, it's a challenge in itself, right?
Oh, absolutely.
This paper highlights how different researchers use different methods and, different ways of measuring it. And sometimes you get wildly different results depending on what you're looking at.
Yeah, that's true. So, for example, if you only look at income, it might seem like a region is making progress.
Right.
But then when you look at, let's say, access to clean water, you get a totally different picture.
Yeah, exactly. So it just adds another layer of complexity to this already really complicated issue. And what's even more concerning is that even though some progress has been made, extreme poverty is actually increasing globally.
Yeah, that's definitely worrying.
Now, moving on to Ghana specifically, the paper highlights this really stark contrast, right, between, the progress that's been made in the country as a whole.
Okay.
But then you look at the northern regions, and it's like a completely different story.
Yeah, it's almost like two different Ghanas.
Yeah.
And the paper attributes this gap to a bunch of factors. Things like historical neglect of the north, lack of infrastructure, and just limited opportunities for economic development in those areas.
Right. And it's interesting because, Ghana's service sector is growing, which is great, but a lot of people in the north still rely really heavily on traditional agriculture, which often isn't enough to lift them out of poverty.
Right.
And then you add in things like high unemployment, especially among young people, and a lack of basic services, things like healthcare and education, especially in rural areas. It just paints kind of a bleak picture.
Yeah. And the paper even brings up this question about external aid, which I thought was interesting.
Oh, yeah.
It points out that NGOs and churches are pretty active in northern Ghana.
Uh-huh.
But it makes you wonder, are they actually addressing the root causes of poverty? Or are they just putting on, a temporary Band-Aid?
It's a good question. Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and talk about the faith leaders themselves, because they're the ones, really on the ground trying to make a difference.
Yeah.
And this paper makes it really clear that these individuals have a ton of influence in Ghana.
They really do.
Yeah.
I mean, think about it. They have this unique position of trust and respect within their communities.
All right.
They're involved in everything from education to healthcare to agriculture.
Yeah.
They're even advocating for social justice. They wear a lot of hats.
Yeah, and the paper even calls churches catalysts for community transformation, which I think is such a powerful way to describe them.
I like that.
Right, they have these deep connections and networks within their communities.
Totally. I mean, those are things that secular organizations often lack.
Yeah, exactly. But here's where things get really interesting, because despite all that influence and the good intentions, faith leaders in northern Ghana face a whole bunch of obstacles when it comes to fighting poverty.
It's not an easy task.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
So the paper outlines 3 main categories of constraints.
Okay.
Resource scarcity,
Okay.
skill gaps,
Uh-huh.
and then, the ever-present challenges of government policies and bureaucracy.
Makes sense.
So starting with resources, a lot of faith-based organizations just don't have the funding to support these big initiatives that you need to really make a dent in poverty.
Yeah, it's like they have the passion and the drive to help, but they lack the resources to really scale up their efforts.
Yeah, exactly. And then speaking of lacking things, the paper also points out this significant skill gap.
Okay.
A lot of faith leaders just don't have the training in areas like, business or social work or project management, all these skills that are essential for running those effective poverty alleviation programs.
Yeah, you need more than just good intentions, right?
Right. You need the know-how.
You need those practical skills.
Yeah.
Otherwise, even with the best intentions, things can fall apart. It's like trying to build a house with just a hammer.
Yeah, good analogy.
You need more tools than that.
Absolutely. And then there's the whole, bureaucratic maze of government policies.
No.
Just trying to navigate all the regulations, getting permits, accessing funding. It can be a nightmare. It's like they're constantly hitting roadblocks.
And the paper really emphasizes how all three of these constraints, resources, skills, and government, they're all intertwined.
Yeah.
Creating this massive web of obstacles that can feel almost impossible to overcome.
And it gets even more complicated, right? Because the paper also highlights these constraints that are specific to the African context.
Right. So on top of everything else, you have things like political instability and conflict.
Yeah, which obviously disrupts any efforts to create long-term development.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then there's inadequate infrastructure, especially in rural areas.
Yeah.
That makes it even harder for those faith leaders to actually reach the communities they're trying to help.
Yeah. And then you have the cultural sensitivities that faith leaders have to navigate too.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, traditions and social norms are important parts of any culture.
Yeah.
But sometimes they can actually perpetuate the cycle of poverty.
It's a tough balance, right?
You've got to respect those traditions, but also promote positive change at the same time.
So moving from, the continent as a whole to Ghana specifically,
Okay.
the paper gets really into the details about some of the unique challenges there.
Yeah.
One that stood out to me was the lack of data on poverty, especially in Muslim communities.
Yeah.
And it makes sense, right? Like, if you don't have accurate information, how are you supposed to target your interventions effectively?
It's a real catch-22. You need the data to understand the problem, but the lack of data makes it hard to even get that information.
Exactly. And then there's a whole concern surrounding zakat.
Okay.
Which, for those who don't know, it's basically a form of almsgiving in Islam.
Right.
And the paper talks about how the lack of transparency and accountability in the collection and distribution of zakat can create distrust.
Yeah, transparency is crucial for building trust within the community.
Right.
And also making sure that the zakat funds are actually going where they're supposed to.
Yeah. And then on top of all that, you've got the pressure from secular NGOs.
Yeah.
They're all competing for the same limited resources.
So it's not just about collaborating with each other.
Yeah.
You've got this whole other layer of competition for funding and support.
Exactly. And of course, we can't forget about the environmental challenges in northern Ghana, like deforestation and unpredictable rainfall patterns.
Right. Those just make things so much harder.
Absolutely.